Hi there everyone, welcome to the second video for week 5 of the course. We're going to continue to begin to dive into Spinoza for this week. In the last video, I tried to explain some core features of Spinoza's, what I called Spinoza's radical rationalism, and I also mentioned univocity, right? And just to reiterate a little bit, the univocity thesis is essentially a thesis that there is one and only one world. There is one and only one meaning of substance, right? Descartes, in some way, splits the world, right, between God, right, who has his own sort of powers of independence, right, and then all of creation, which is dependent on his whim, right? This is why Descartes thought that God put all of motion into matter, as we saw previously, right? And so God is responsible for a continuous creation of everything that exists, right? And so God, in some ways, transcends the world, right? God doesn't exist within the world. God selects the relevant features about the world and creates the world, right? And this is essential to this sort of Christian picture about God in creation, right? That happens in Genesis, especially, right? It's like over the course of so many days, right? God creates everything in the world. God pre-exists the world in important ways, right? You have this split in the world that is essential to the Christian religious worldview, or at least it was considered essential at the time. And so what that meant is that for Descartes, that there was a split, there's a fundamental limitation to human knowledge and the sort of world that we can know versus the actual nature of reality that is accessible to God alone and is decided by God alone. And so even though we can use our human powers of cognition to know certain limited facts about ourselves, like that we exist and that there is a God, right? Philosophy cannot really go further than this in determining the who and the what and the how regarding creation, the essence of God, the nature of ultimate reality. Importantly for Descartes, there is no deeper answer, right? If you ask, like, why is there, bodies and mind in the world and that's all that there is, Descartes would appeal to nothing other than, well, that was apparently, the whim of God, right? All things depend on God. God, put motion into the universe, right? And so is in that way sort of directly responsible for everything that happens. So, there is no deeper rational answer where we can understand the perspective of God, right? And so equivocity is this thesis that, reality is fundamentally split in that respect, that, there are essential aspects of reality that have always been and will always be inaccessible to human reason. By contrast, Spinoza believes that the essence of God actually is directly accessible to reason, and that there's nothing about God's nature that could ever be unreasonable, right? That could ever sort of escape or transcend the requirements of rationality, right? From Spinoza's perspective, and we're going to see this especially in next week's reading, in particular the appendix to part 1, Those of you who are atheists in the class or questioning Christians will probably find this document very, very interesting, because what Descartes says essentially is that our propensity to think about God as being like us, right? We are made in the image of God, is nothing more than a human prejudice, right? We want the world to be good for us. And so we imagine, choose to believe, engage in wishful thinking that the person or thing that orders the universe has our interests in mind, right? We're finite creatures. Things are good or bad for us, right? And so we engage in these prejudicial, wishful thinking, kinds of thought patterns precisely out of our weakness. That is Spinoza's claim. And that, were we to be able to lead ourselves to a rational assessment of the situation, that we would feel none of the need for prejudice, superstition, etc. about the nature of the absolute or the divine, because we could know that it was perfect without assuming that perfection meant a good outcome for us in particular, right? And this is how Spinoza's early works, as I've written up here, begin with the treatise. I just wrote treatise here, but the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, right? This is Spinoza's own way of, in a certain sense, rewriting the Meditations, right? Like the Meditations, it sort of begins in doubt, right, and suffering. It has a sort of more practical dimension to it, Spinoza says things like, if you exist in this life, then you're going to suffer because of other finite creatures, and that's what it means to be finite, right? Like, we suffer because of our bosses, because people are rude to us or detract from us in some capacity, right? They cut us off from our joy and our capacity to live, and that is sort of like our nature as a finite creature. And so Spinoza, much like, you can think alternatively of like Buddhist traditions, right? Or maybe the ancient Greek tradition, wants to think that, if we could understand reality, right, then the fact that we must suffer can be made more intelligible and so more acceptable to us in principle. And so Spinoza thinks, well, if we could know the impersonal nature of reality, right, then we wouldn't develop attachments and become very disappointed whenever they fail, to be met and so on, right? And so Spinoza, like Descartes, is also looking for, a kind of criterion of knowledge. Like, how can I not have these sort of investments in the world, right? Like, if I'm invested in me winning the lottery and I base all my life and my decisions around that, then when it doesn't happen, I'm very, sad and disappointed, right? Is there anything in life that is like a sure bet, that isn't just kind of one of these lottery tickets, essentially? You might think about like our desire to be happy with our family or whatever. We tend to think about these relationships as not being as chancy, right, as career goals, etc. Which is true for some people, but not true for others, right? So for some people, just like career prospects don't work out, familial life doesn't work out. And so, Spinoza is searching for something that can be a source of joy and empowerment for everyone, regardless of your circumstances, right? And so he's intrinsically not looking for these contingent things that might make you happy, but are also might make you unhappy, right? They might actually increase your suffering to some extent, and that's just part of what it means to be a good family member, right? Is knowing that these people, can make you suffer, and, deciding whether or not that's worth it, right? And so really, this is what leads Spinoza to think about God, right? Essentially, his thought process is, if we can understand the universe, then we can accept our place within it, right? And that's why the sort of ethical concerns that really motivate the beginning of the treatise quickly become epistemological concerns, right? Because, his answer ultimately is the worship of God, right? That is what is going to bring happiness and understanding and acceptance, right? But it's very important that you do it in the right way, right? A rational appreciation for God. That is ultimately what is going to bring happiness and joy in Spinoza's eyes. And so, for him, if your belief in God is ultimately tied to the idea that God is going to provide you with an afterlife, and then you can see passed on relatives and so on, and like that's kind of like part of the deal, right? Then Spinoza would say, well, your worship of God is no different than, someone else's worship of a lottery ticket, right? You're not worshiping God because of God's power, or you're not understanding God and rationally appreciating why the universe has to be the way that it is, right? You're looking for a payout, right? At least that's Spinoza's very incendiary argument, right? And you can see why this would really piss people off, right? Because he's essentially saying that their belief in God is rooted entirely in selfish, idiotic superstition, right? A superstition that is not even functional for making people happy, right? For Spinoza, actually, he believes that these sort of superstitions ultimately make us unhappy. It's like that moment where I feel like I really deserve something and I don't get it, or something that shakes my confidence and that makes me think that the world maybe isn't set up for me to win, and so on. And so if my convictions are based in a certain way on weak foundations, wishful thinking about the way that I wish the world was, then when you hit a snag, right, and things come tumbling down on you, then you will have this sort of crisis of faith, right? Whereas to the contrary, Spinoza imagines that if you have this sort of rational investment in the idea of God, then nothing that ever happens in the universe like that, there can be no flood or plague or war or any event like that, anything negative that could happen in your life that would cause you to no longer appreciate, the order and splendor of God and the universe, right? And so it's interesting, I think. It is extremely challenging to those who hold traditional religious beliefs, in part because Spinoza wants to discover the sources of that belief and to some extent debunk it, right? And so to that extent, it makes sense why people would think about Spinoza as an atheist. And, just to add an additional dimension to this, there were some people who called themselves Spinozists that would say things like, like whatever creed, like whatever people are reading at the church or whatever, I will mouth the words and so on because I understand that this is important for social reasons. But essentially, I don't believe in that conception of God, or really any conception of God. I only believe in nature, right? That's what these Spinozists would say. And so you can imagine why that's very frightening to a religious community, right? You don't want, if you're a priest or a bishop or something like that, you don't want everyone in your church to not actually believe in any of the revelation or scripture and so on, but just be willing to mouth the words and so on, right? And so you start becoming very strict about what actually makes you a Christian and so on, right? And you begin to get into all of these debates about factions of Christians, and so on. So they thought it was very important to stamp out, yeah, essentially, Spinozism. Spinozism was for hundreds of years basically synonymous with atheism, in part because of this extremely harsh critique of religious beliefs. You might also call it a critique of anthropocentrism. So, anthropo, that just means human being. And centrism, just means that you're centering them, right? And so, what Spinoza is saying essentially is that in the religious sphere, we still have a pre-Copernican conception of the universe, right? Where human beings are at the center of it. And to truly become modern is to adopt the Copernican perspective where human beings are no longer at the center of the universe. Okay, so that's to say a lot. I apologize for giving so many broad general overviews for Spinoza, but we're going to see next week that the material is very difficult because of the way that it's written, and so there's going to be kind of a jump in difficulty, and it can be kind of difficult to feel like you have your bearings or like you understand it all, what's going on, right? Because we're going to be looking at Spinoza's Ethics next week, and that's a book that he wrote essentially almost like a math book, right? And so he has axioms and definitions, and he tries to derive things, right? And we need to try to understand what that kind of framework is trying to say and why it's important. And so getting a kind of broad general overview for what Spinoza is trying to do, I think hopefully will be very helpful in trying to come to understand that material. So let's talk more about the board. Okay. So the main section of the treatise on the emendation for the intellect that I want to talk about for this video is, at one point, Spinoza distinguishes between different kinds of sources of knowledge, right? And he lists 4 of them. And these go in the order from the least strong, so like the weakest evidence that you can have possible for something, to the strongest evidence that you can have for something, right? And so, this kind of gives us a guideline for how do you place your bets, in terms of what matters. Do you place your bets on things that you don't know very well, or do you look for the absolutely firm, solid foundations, right? Obviously, he's a rationalist, so he's going to go for the firm foundations, right? And so just to list the 4 sources of knowledge, the 4 sources are testimony, perception, reason, and intuition. And I wrote these in 2 different colors. The first 2 are red and the second 2 are blue because they form 2 classes of knowledge, right? And this will be familiar to us from Descartes. Imaginative knowledge, right? You might also say empirical knowledge or something like that, experimental knowledge, and rational knowledge, right? And so you have 2 classes, but within each class, right, you also have a distinction. So, let's talk more about that. In this kind of purplish color, right below where I wrote the name of what it was, I wrote kind of a definition, at least something workable, and an example, right? So what is testimony? Testimony is indirect experience, or facts about things that you don't experience yourself, but you experience other people telling you about it, right? So example would be maybe facts about your birth, right? We were all born, and there are certain facts about when we were born, right? Like how much people were crying and what it was like in that year, so on and so forth, right? And those are things that we don't know directly, right? I was just a baby, right? And so I don't have any memory or knowledge of that moment, but my parents can tell me about it, right? And so this is testimonial knowledge. It's indirect knowledge. It's knowledge that you get from experience, but specifically the experiences of other people, right? Very importantly, right? It's important to think about everything in the Torah and the Bible goes in this category, right? It goes in the weakest possible category, right? What kind of knowledge could we have of, the resurrection or something like that? Well, we can only have like extremely indirect evidence of that, right? And so this is another aspect of Spinoza's rationalism that really grates against Orthodox religious believers at this point, right? He's essentially thrown all revelation into the garbage bin category of testimony, right? And that's not to say that all testimony is wrong, right? There are certain circumstances where testimonial evidence is enough, right? If you're like, hey, where's the bathroom? And someone points in a certain direction, that's enough, right? That's enough to act on for that moment, right? But that's not a good basis for like the foundation of your religious beliefs or, something like that, right? And so also belonging to this category of imaginative knowledge, we also have direct perception, right? Which is like the direct experience of something. So like I see a book, for example, right? This is something that is not relayed through another person, right? It's more direct because you don't have the possibility about, the person who provided you the testimony lying or that they missaw it or something like that, right? If there's any problem, the problem happened on your end, right? And so this is what we mean, by ordinary cases of perception. You see something, you smell something, so on and so forth. You heard something, any of that, right? Okay. So, but then in a completely different class is rational knowledge, right? And so number 3 is reason here. And so here I want to bring back a term that I introduced when we were talking about Descartes, and that's inferential knowledge. So, knowledge that leads me to something else, like a chain of reasoning, right? And these kinds of statements are paradigmatically conditional statements. So if this, then that, right? An example of rational, reasonable inferential knowledge is like, if there is a triangle in the universe, or if this angle forms a right triangle, then you can apply these mathematical facts about right triangles to it, right? You can apply the Pythagorean theorem, or do whatever else, right? But importantly, where this kind of knowledge is incomplete is it's conditional, right? If there's a triangle in the universe, then this stuff, right? And this is kind of how Descartes thought about mathematical truth too. That mathematical truth is a kind of rational knowledge, but it's one that you make by following certain steps and putting them in an order, right? And so as a kind of rational knowledge, it works through links in a chain, right? By contrast, in intuition, and Spinoza, sometimes intuition is used as a synonym for perception, and it just means like to see something, for something to seem some way, or something like that. But for Spinoza uses the word intuition in a different sense. For Spinoza, intuition is a non-inferential, immediate kind of knowledge, right? So what kind of knowledge is like that? The cogito, right? I don't need to, the cogito is not something I learn from other things, right? It doesn't depend on other truths and then I reach it as a conclusion, right? It's an immediate truth. And that's exactly why it can defeat the evil demon, right? In the first meditation, this important skeptical argument, right? And so you can almost think about these four as forming kind of like a scale where the ones at the top are, you know, maybe this is like power, right? And this is testimony. Testimony has the least power. Wait, that's not right. Never mind. The point is just that testimony has the least power, it has the least ability to tell you about the world. Intuition, well, the things that intuition, rational intuition tells you are always true, right? There's absolutely no circumstance in which the cogito is false. It is not possible for you to think but not to be. There's no coherent situation in which you could like fill out false to that statement. And it's not on the basis of anything else, it's on the basis of its own immediate certainty. What Spinoza is going to say later that's very interesting is that we get this kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge, through the realization that we are God. Right? Not that, you know, my own interests are like God's interests or something like that, like a megalomaniac kind of way. But just to say that, like, well, if God is truly everything and exists everywhere and everything is dependent on God, right, then human beings as themselves only modes of a substance are themselves an expression of God. Right? And so in the same way that I can know facts about the cogito because I am that thing, so too Spinoza believes we can come to knowledge about God because we are nothing but a determinate expression of God in a particular situation. So that's an interesting idea. It's very difficult for us to understand, and we're going to continue to talk about it into the next week, right? But this is the transformation that intuition has in Spinoza. For Descartes, intuition was limited to the cogito, and then we had to go outside the cogito, right, into something else. Whereas for Spinoza, the realization of the cogito is the realization that we are an expression of God, right? So there's no radical disjunct between what you might call the moves in the second and the third meditation, or where Descartes gives his cogito argument, and then when he starts proving the existence of God. Okay, and so now briefly, let's talk about the letter on the infinite. So one thing you might say as a kind of conclusion from what we've reached in the treatise is that we need to have a distinct and rational knowledge of the essence of things if we want a firm foundation, right? And what the letter on the infinite gives us essentially is a way of depicting the essence of God, the strictly rational essence of God, right? This is a very difficult idea, but I think it is one that makes sense, one that we can come to understand together. And the crucial thing for understanding Spinoza's letter on the infinite is to understand the distinction between two kinds of infinity, right? And they have very specific definitions. We might call infinity 1 the good infinity. We can also call infinity 1 God. We can call infinity 1 the essence of substance or something like that. Infinity 1 is the infinity that belongs to God, right? Infinity 2 is the infinity that belongs to things created by God. And so infinity 1, as we're going to see, is a qualitative kind of infinity, while infinity 2 is a quantitative kind of infinity. let's start out with the one that's easier to understand, the quantitative infinity, right? Imagine, if you will, for a moment, the largest possible collection of entities that you can conceivably imagine, right? So think about how many billions of subatomic particles are within, a very small space of matter. Then think about how many trillions of light years there are in the universe, right? And now you have in your mind an inconceivably large amount of stuff, right? That we might call the infinite universe. And scientifically, like, you can essentially kind of look at large scale depictions of what the universe is like, right? It's very abstract, but you can do that. And so one thing that we might be tempted to say is that collection of stuff is infinite, right? It's so large, it's so great that we could never ever possibly conceive of finishing counting it, right? But one thing about this picture that is fundamental to it, it's fundamental to how numbers work, is that you can add to that number, right? For however large, however infinitely large, right, we conceive that number to be, we can always imagine adding one, or doubling it, or multiplying it by itself, right? The nature of mathematical operations is that they do not stop with our psychological makeup, right? The fact that I can't imagine anything longer doesn't mean that I can't modify this. To the contrary, the tools of mathematics say that you can. And so an important feature of this infinity is that it is divisible, right? It can be made larger, it can be multiplied, it can be divided, right? We can conceive of this kind of infinity, the infinity of all things, as getting larger or smaller, right? And so this infinite is infinite by virtue of its cause, right? There's an infinite amount of stuff in the universe because that is what followed from the Big Bang. And features about the Big Bang could have been different, at least theoretically, to change the number of things in the universe, how many subatomic particles there are, how they're configured, and so on. And so this kind of infinity is an infinite effect. It's something that is infinite by virtue of a cause. Ooh. Yeah, sorry about that. Knocked my little thing here. Okay, so this infinite is infinite by virtue of its cause. And so by that token, it's divisible. You can affect its infinity by, adding stuff to the universe, subtracting stuff from the universe, changing, features about the Big Bang, and so on. So it's a quantitative infinity. It's caused by something, and it's fundamentally divisible. But now try to think about God. God is indivisible. This is the fundamental feature about God. Why is that a fundamental feature about God? Because if God were divisible into parts, then the parts would be more fundamental than God. Right? God would be the amalgamation of a certain number of parts that are related to each other, that exist independently of one another, that exist independently of being an aggregate, right? And so if God were made of parts, then God cannot be God. God cannot be the fundamental absolute substance of the universe, because there would be little bits of God, you might think of them as God particles or something like that, that are themselves more fundamental than God, right? And if that were true, then these God particles would make God up, right? We could imagine God as being bigger or smaller or stronger or smarter in virtue of being configured differently in terms of the God particles and so on, right? This would give us a lot of features about God that are appropriate for this kind of infinity, right? It's actually consonant with the way that we want to think about the infinity of the universe, but it's completely inappropriate for thinking about God as an absolute substance, that which everything is dependent on, right? Because if God were composed of parts, then God would be dependent on those parts. But by contrast, everything is supposed to be dependent on God, not the other way around. And so God has a different kind of infinity, an infinity that we can call infinity one, or the good infinite, or qualitative infinity. And this is infinite by virtue of essence. So it's not just a contingent fact about God that God is infinite, like there was a certain number of God particles, and once you reached it, boom, you get like the real omnipotent God or something like that, right? That is inconceivable, right? Instead, it has to in some way belong to the essence of God to be infinite. And so what is the essence of this qualitative and good infinity? We're going to see in more detail next week that it is causa sui, which means to be the cause of itself. So God is not dependent on anything else. God causes itself, themself, right? He, her, whatever, self, right? God is the cause of itself. And so God is not caused to do things by virtue of how its parts are configured or anything like that. Instead, God is completely self-determining, right? Its infinity stems from the fact that it is not finite. It cannot be limited by anything else, right? By contrast, this kind of infinity is always related to limitation and can always be made greater or smaller. So what is the point of all of this? Well, Spinoza thinks that really what happened in the Middle Ages and what is sort of continuing to happen into his day is that people can just conflate and confuse these two different kinds of infinity, right? So, sort of traditional theological question might be something like, can God create a boulder so big that he can't lift it, right? And what that idea sort of gets across to us is that it seems like there has to be some kind of limit to God's infinity, right? But for Spinoza, that's because we're conceiving of it in a very mythological, anthropocentric sort of perspective, right? We're imagining God's like us. God just kind of lifts up and does things and creates finite objects and so on. And so we're imagining God's infinity as if it were this kind of quantitative, divisible infinity that we could just like measure or something like that, right? And so Spinoza argues essentially that we run into all of these deep metaphysical problems, theological problems, and so on, because we do not see the immediate essence of God as causa sui, right? And instead, we think about God as if God were the kind of finite, dependent sort of thing that we are, right? That's given by the second infinity. Okay, this video has already gone on a little bit longer than I would have liked. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to talking with you more about Spinoza as we dive into the ethics for next week. Bye.